Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. I think we're slowly going to start. So I will switch to Italian for just a couple of minutes in which I will give a brief introduction, and then I will go back to English. So please hang in there if you don't understand Italian, because I will be back to English very, very soon. Benvenute a tutti e tutte al webinar di oggi. Il webinar è organizzato da RiSME, il gruppo di ricerca sulla musica elettronica e la computer music, che è cominciato più o meno un anno fa a questo punto, ed è stato fondato all'interno della Società Italiana di Musicologia, e è anche supportato da AIMI, l'Associazione per l'Informatica Musicale in Italia. E quindi ringraziamo per il supporto istituzionale di questi due gruppi, e poi ovviamente Giacomo e Alberta per il supporto tecnico, nonché Giacomo e Laura per l'instancabile energia che mettono nel progetto di RiSME dalla sua fondazione. E oggi abbiamo tre ospiti, che sono Daniele Shlomit Sofer, Michela Garda e Johann Merrich. Quindi parleremo del libro che è stato pubblicato da poco, nel 2022, per MIT Press, Sex Sounds, Vectors of Difference in Electronic Music, di Daniele Shlomit Sofer. Quindi è molto bello. Due parole su RiSME, perché potete, vi metterò il link al sito nella chat. Oramai il sito di RiSME ha svariati contenuti al suo interno, gli scorsi webinar, ma anche i video del seminario organizzato alla Fondazione Cini a dicembre, che era il seminario sulla Computer Assisted Composition Perspectives on Human-Machine Interaction. Quindi potete trovare i video dell'evento in quella sede, quindi vi invito a esplorare i contenuti che sono stati creati finora. E comincio con le biografie delle nostre ospiti. Comincio con Daniele. Il dottor Daniele Shlomit Sofer è Visiting Assistant Professor di Teoria e Tecnologia Musicale presso l'Università di Dayton e cofondatore del LGBTQ+ Music Study Group all'interno della Associazione di Musicologia Americana. Nel suo lavoro Sofer esamina vari mezzi di mediazione elettronica, esplorando come il genere attraversa dinamicamente l'attuale attivismo per la giustizia sociale, le resistenze coloniali, così come la costruzione storica e sistemiche di razza e sessualità. Gli articoli del dottor Sofer sulle riviste American Music e Organized Sound indagano come il sesso si manifesta in modo udibile nella musica elettronica, individuando come il genere percepito sia importante per capire come e perché il sesso è così prominente in opere come quelle di Alice Shields e Barry Truax. Quindi oggi parleremo del suo libro Sex Sounds, Vectors of Difference in Electronic Music. A discutere con il dottor Sofer c'è la dottoressa e professoressa Michela Garda, professoressa all'Università di Pavia nel Dipartimento di Musicologia a Cremona, che si occupa di estetica e di sociologia musicale, e i suoi attuali interessi di ricerca si concentrano sulla nozione di performatività con particolare riguardo alla voce. Su questi temi ha curato con Eleonora Rocconi il volume Registrare la performance, testi, modelli e simulacri tra memoria e immaginazione per Pavia University Press nel 2016, e recentemente con Serena Facci la raccolta di saggi The Female Voice in the 20th Century, edito da Routledge nel 2021. in più parlava prima di un nuovo progetto editoriale che uscirà fra poco sulla una nuova raccolta sulla tecnologia della voce, se ho capito bene, ma magari ci sarà modo di parlare anche di questo. E l'altra interlocutrice è Johann Merrich, organizzatrice di suoni e parte del tuo sperimentale L'impero della luce. Johann Merrich è ricercatrice indipendente negli ambiti della storia della musica elettronica, dove concentra le sue attenzioni sui contributi delle donne nella costruzione del suono nuovo. È autrice dei libri Breve storia della musica elettronica e delle sue protagoniste per Arcana Edizioni e Le pioniere della musica elettronica per Auditorium Edizioni. Ha una rubrica che si chiama Brevi Storie e che è accolta mensilmente dal 2019 su musicaelettronica.it, che vi consiglio di leggere perché è un ottimo outlet se già non lo leggete, e gli articoli di Johann sono apparsi nel blog di Red Bull Music Academy Daily e Thomann International. Dal 2020 fa parte del progetto europeo Key Change dedicato alla parità di genere nell'industria musicale. E quindi I'm going to switch to English now, or I'm going to be a little bit more brief because we're going to use English for the rest of the time. So many of these aspects I think will emerge during today, and maybe I invite the presenters to also turn on their cameras if they want to. So welcome to today's webinar, which is organized by RiSME Digitali, the study group within the Italian Musicological Society on electronic and computer-based musics. So we started last year to have these webinars where we discuss interesting books that have been recently appeared, and today is no exception with an amazing recent book by Dr. Daniele Shlomit Sofer, Sex Sounds, Vector of Difference in Electronic Music by MIT Press. So just a quick note about RiSME. There is a website that will be shortly posted in the chat, and now there is quite a bit of content on the website. There are also videos on a seminar that was organized in December by the group called Computer-Assisted Composition Perspectives on Human-Machine Interaction. So if these are topics that, and there are also the previous book presentations. So if these are topics that interest you, please go and enjoy the videos. So today, instead, this is the third webinar, and we have with us the author of the book, Daniele Shlomit Sofer. So Dr. Sofer is a visiting assistant professor of music theory and technology at the University of Dayton and co-founder of the LGBTQ+ music study group. Dr. Sofer's scholarship examines various means of electronic mediation, exploring how gender cuts dynamically across current social justice activism, post-colonial resistances, as well as historical and systemic constitutions of race and sexuality. Their articles in American Music and Organized Sound journals investigate how sex manifests audibly in electronic music, pointing specifically to perceived gender as a consideration for how and why sex features so prominently in works like Alice Shield's Apocalypse and in Buried Drugs songs. And I think we will talk about more of these things in just a few minutes. Talking with Dr. Sofer today is Professor Michela Garda, who is a professor at the University of Pavia in the Department of Musicology. Garda deals with aesthetics and musical sociology. Her current research interests focus on the notion of performativity with particular regard to the voice. On these issues, she edited with Eleonora Rocconi a volume for Pavia University Press. My tentative translation would be Recording the Performance Text Models and Simulacra Between Memory and Imagination. And in 2021, with Serena Paci, she published the collection of essays, The Female Voice in the 20th Century, for Routledge. And together with Professor Michela Garda, there is Johann Merrich, who is a sound organizer and part of the experimental duo L'Impero della Luce, the Empire of Light. Johann Merrich is a freelance researcher in the fields of electronic music history, where she focuses her attention on the contributions of women in the construction of new sound. She's the author of the books A Short History of Electronic Music and its One-Man Protagonist, translated into English thanks to the Marianne Stigman Foundation and Heroines of Sound Festival, and Le Pioniere della Musica Elettronica, Pioneering Women of Electronic Music, for Auditorium Edizioni. Since 2019, her monthly column Brevi Storie, Short Stories, is hosted by Musicaelettronica.it, Tempo Reale's web portal. Her articles have appeared on the Red Bull Music Academy Daily and Thomann International blogs. So I'm overly excited for today's webinar, and especially of having these three amazing minds and people in one place. I'm very indebted to all of them, for Daniele, even though we've never met, for offering me such a good reading, for Michela Garda for being my professor during my undergraduate and master years, and and she was the only person that really introduced me during my undergraduate and master years to feminist musicology. So I will be forever indebted to her for this, and to Johann Merrich, because even though we've never met physically, we shared many virtual spaces, and since the first time, it has always been a beautiful connection. And this is just like another appointment in this storyline of our virtual connection. So the way in which we're going to do this is Daniele is going to give an introduction to their book, and then Michela and Johann will give responses with some interesting questions, and then the floor will be open for Daniele to answer the questions first, and then for the audience to just chime in with your questions. So feel free to type in your questions in the chat from moment zero or later on, and then when the floor will be open, you can just raise your hand and ask the question away. So with no further ado, please, Dr. Sofer, welcome. And I'm very curious about what you want to tell us about your book.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you for that generous introduction. I am really excited to be here today to talk about the book, but also to hear what everybody's responses are. So please, if you have any questions, even if you haven't read the book, if you have a question about a specific topic that's of interest to you, that's great. I realize that the topic is quite broad. It touches on so many different aspects that I couldn't possibly cover everything in a book or even in a short 5-10 minute talk. So in any case, please, I need to be able to share my screen if that's okay, if you can give me the permission there. And I also wanted to add that as of this year, I'm no longer a visiting assistant professor, but regular assistant professor. And here I'm now sharing. Okay, so buongiorno a tutti. I will make it so I can see a few people, so I'm not alone anyway. I'm really excited to be here with the Italian Musicological Society today, and a special study group on electronic music. This is very rare that I get to address a topic that with folks who actually understand the topic in depth. So I hope it's not too simplistic what I present here, but I'll try to give some depth. I want to talk about the motivations for pursuing this project and identify upfront here some of the challenges that I encountered while I was researching and writing the book. But before we start all of that, my central question, my first and foremost central question that I encountered was, what does sex sound like? And you're welcome here to add into the chat if you want to. Sometimes I find when I ask this question, there's a little bit of hesitation. There is some delay. And I wonder sometimes if that plays into the taboo of our difficulty of describing sound in these spaces, or also that the question is, there's two layers of questions here. Are we talking about sound in the musical context? Are we talking about actual sounds? Sounds luxurious or too sensuous? So then we start to get into this metaphorical language and maybe not explicit sounds there. Sometimes we think about obscenity or pornography in the case of, there was a famous US judge who said, oh, I know it when I see it, but maybe it's I know it when I hear it, but thinking about those sounds explicitly. Community, sexuality and gender expression. So resonances between people. Sometimes people will talk about slapping sounds, sloshing sounds. People will talk about moaning sounds, and then it gets into larger questions about duration, time, of extent. Somebody wrote here, sex sounds reflect differences, relations about power. Breathing sounds, there we get to the body now. Because up until now, if you noticed all of these responses, they had nothing to do with physical bodies. So the sound somehow makes it feel like we're divorcing ourselves from our body, the way maybe we're trained to listen. What kind of music do you think of when you talk about sexual music? I think that changes a little bit now that you've read my book, but possibly you had a different idea. Chromaticism. Yeah, I mean, here they give the example of Russian music, but chromaticism historically, I think already from the medieval ages, whether we're talking with a B natural or a B flat, this has always been this question of, if you're changing the chromatic tension there is something alluring about it, there's desire, there's something illicit. And anytime we're drawing something out, somehow that's connected to sex for a lot of people. So I haven't gotten the Russian music question before, although that was my area of research in my master's degree. So I'll have to think about that a little bit more clearly. But I would say the early 20th century chromatic Russian music was moving in a communist sense towards the egalitarianism of the society. So trying to move away from gender. And at some points there were pressures on people to be more free to talk about sex, because we're supposed to be free from the yoke of whatever patriarchy or of the monarchies and things like that. And so people had to try to be a little bit more flexible there. Yes, and gender neutral, which put more pressure on women, but I don't have time to talk about that today. So I'm going to move more toward a US and European Eurocentric concentration, because that's where my research for the book ended up. That's not by chance. I mean, first of all, that's the area that I was taught, and so the area that I was more confused about when I was trying to figure out what was going on. And also because it's not a coincidence that I'm focusing on the Western canonic music that is considered to be dominating, but we don't really shine a lens on it, shine a light on it. So on the one hand, there have historically been a push from Puritans in the white Protestant and evangelical Christian spaces to over-sexualize non-white populations. And we see this in the book, in the early chapters. For example, those of African heritage or South Asian descent. And in my book, I talk about Pierre Schaeffer and his exploration being compared to Robinson Crusoe. On the other hand, there's this habitual association of sex from this dominant group, from the group that's keeping the written musical notation, but also written description of musical history, has forced folks in non-white spaces to confront these stereotypes and to pick up the same tropes that are considered maybe reductive or essentialist, and to transpose those, to respond to the tropes in ways that are affirmative. And this is the reason, for example, Trisha Rose, who's written about hip hop in the US, she gives that the reason why women rappers in the 1990s would adopt coarse language, or rappers today use aggressive delivery typical of the male gangsta rappers, what they called gangster rappers in the 1990s from the West Coast. So using that kind of aggressive, vulgar language, but in a way that's conscientious, that it is considered hyper-masculinist. And because of this, I thought of folks like Rose, Gwendolyn Poe, Guthrie Ramsey, and I think that they handled these issues in popular music very well. When I began my project, I thought it made more sense to examine music that seemingly didn't talk about sexuality at all. So I didn't want to talk about hip hop. I didn't want to talk about R&B, disco, all of these musics that typically have had a rich history talking about electronic components and sexuality. So I said, okay, let me focus on electroacoustic music. My project started, let me get here into the next slide. There we go. My project started with a prompt when I was in school, and the professor asked us to look up music from the last 10 years and to find a piece of music and to write about it analytically. This was a phenomenological class, a music analysis class, but also phenomenology in the philosophical sense. And so I just went to Nexus and I started looking up. I just put the limiter on and said, okay, pieces from the last 10 years. And I found this piece by Berlin-based Juliana Hodgkinson and the Danish composer Niels Ronsholt, and it's called Fish and Fowl. We can just hear a little bit of it. So I heard this piece that you can't see anything, and you start asking yourself, what are these sounds? Who is making them? How do I make sense of that? And these were the questions from my dissertation. I amassed about 40 pieces here from electroacoustic works. I said, I'm only looking at electroacoustic composers, whatever that means. And I settled on these examples. I said, Pierre Schaeffer and Henri's Symphonie pour un homme seul from 1950. This was the earliest piece I found, and it had an erotica movement, and I tried to make sense of that. So even though people have talked about this piece as setting the stage for the kind of listening divorced from sight, that movement was suspiciously absent from what people were talking about. There's various pieces by Luc Ferrari. I brought, and he was Schaeffer's assistant, so that's not surprising, although in the book I talk about their disagreements. I brought pieces from Alice Shields, who was foundational at the Columbia Princeton Electronic Music Center. And she and I just came out with a 3-part interview about this history on the podcast Unsung Stories from Columbia University. So you can find that through Spotify and Apple Music and so on. I looked at music by Barry Truax for a long time. He was the only out gay composer of electroacoustic music. And even as recently as 2013, 2014, when I interviewed him and I said, can you show me other composers like you? He was reticent. He was reluctant to tell me basically because he doesn't want to out composers who aren't comfortable making those connections between their history, their personal history, and the sounds of the music itself. But after a long time, maybe it was possibly too late already, I realized that I had a lot of white composers, a lot of European, a lot of American composers, and I didn't have any people of color. So after I had written what I thought was going to be the book, I started doing these explorations, and I went to the RiLM database, which is the big database for musicologists in English, at least, to look for abstracts, but it has lots of other languages. And I said, okay, let me look for electroacoustic music. And astonishingly, these books don't come up when you type in the word electroacoustic. So then I started adding qualifiers, electroacoustic and women, electroacoustic and Black, and so on. Lots of people with the name Black came up, but not one Black composer or artist or author out of 2,000 results in the search. So what did the word electroacoustic actually mean? And this is when I turned to writing the book that you have before you. So here are the results. You can see electronic music has a much wider, diverse, inclusive portfolio here. And then you can see I tried to look for gospel, I tried to look for the words hip hop and so on. You can read about that in this article in Contemporary Music Review. But basically, so the first half of the book looks at all the people who are typically electroacoustic composers. And then I identified this term electrosexual music, which is what I use in the book. And electrosexual music, oh, sorry, these are all the databases that I actually went through afterwards to kind of examine what electroacoustic music was, who is represented, and it replicated these searches across these websites. So most of the folks who come up are white men from European heritage. And then the only exception here is the Institute for Composer Diversity, where you see I have this example from Prince comes up, Pamela Z comes up. But when I spoke to the curator of that database, he actually was confused as to why they were there and couldn't answer and wanted to take them out. And I said, well, maybe we should keep them. But that's a question, again, that we need to, I think, as a community address and ask why those composers, artists appear there and whether they should. So, as I was saying, so electrosexual music, for the way that to describe the kinds of electroacoustic music I found in those beginning days that composers said deliberately they wrote with sexual qualities in mind. This is after I found all this music. I found that all the pieces they express sex without conveying any specific sex acts. So because it's invisible, we're left to imagine what's the physical actions are happening, or whether there is a person, who is the person that's there. There's a teleological drive to climax, as we heard in that example from Fish and Fowl. Sometimes it arrives, sometimes it's sublimated, but that's about perception there. And most of the composers who intentionally created sexualized music employed a feminized voice. We don't know if the voice belongs to a woman, but it's meant to sound that way, which is how then the music carries on these gendered and racialized tropes. It draws on certain kinds of habits that we have already associations in music, and in that way it is still gendered, even if we can't see who the performer is and we want to be generous. So I just show you the full table of contents here. So that was the first half of the book with the electrosexual sort of stereotype. And the second half of the book here is music that also is considered sexual, but more likely to be heard on the radio, some of it. It has taken up those stereotypes, or the very narrow definition of sexuality in music that I present in the first half of the book, and expands it and pulls it apart. And so I'm going to leave you here. These are my motivations for writing the book, and I'm happy to expand on anything you've heard. And I really look forward to hearing the discussion here. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. That was already so rich. Thank you so very much. But we are in for a treat because I know that Michela and Johann's answers will also be very rich. So please, Daniela, Michela, take it away.
So thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me in this exciting conversation. I'm so happy to meet Danielle in person, in virtual person, as for me it's in person. And now I read some comments about first the experience of reading your book. So it was an exciting journey in the sense that the book offers much more than the introduction promises. At the beginning, I was expecting a sort of a remake applied to electronic music of what Susan McClary did, with some examples of the so-called classical music. As soon as I approached the case studies, I became more and more attentive and curious. I felt I was sharing your journey in a cultural and musical landscape in search of ethical and aesthetical mapping. And this was also important for me, also this union of ethic and aesthetics together. And I especially enjoyed your analytical outlines and how they are embedded in the culture. So I appreciated your critical conversation with your travel friends, Brian Kane, Stephen Connor, Georgia Gamben, all of them renowned male voice theorists, and then Anna Bosma, Gail Rubin, Sarah Ahmed, and of course, Susan McClary. At the end of the journey, I am happy to have the opportunity, thanks to Laura and Valentina, to discuss the book with you, or better, to revisit the most exciting places and listen to your comments. Well, you give a strong motivation for the subject of this book, to break the taboo of talking about sex in a field, electronic music, that from the point of view of the global world of music, looks like a reserve of white male intellectual privilege, but it retains the power to inform the master narrative of Western music history. And your counter narrative, you claim and you give strong evidence of the existence of what you call electrosexual music. How would you describe this category? Is it a meta-genre that cuts across traditional genres and subgenres? It is a label for collecting case studies, operating on a specific cultural and music trope, that is a feminized voice, as you said before, and climax mechanisms. So I think it is also important for the prospective reader to understand better the relationship between music, electronic music, and sexuality. In your introduction, you write that the aim of the book is establishing a sonic profile for sex acts as they have been represented in electronic music. And then you mention the difficulties in pinpointing music's sexual qualities. And in another place, you write that composers themselves took up the task of writing music that arouses associations to sexuality and eroticism. Well, I found different terms such as representation, association with, music sexual quality. I do not want to come back to the worn-out debate about music as a non-representational art. I'm just asking you to expand a little bit on this, or better to guide us on thinking about this hybrid term, electrosexual, beyond the traditional aesthetical discussions and positions. I have a question about your intellectual genealogy. Your book starts with distancing yourself from Susan McClary and ends with a warm homage to her and Anna Bosma. How much does your project draw on her premises, and how much does it differ from them? Here is important your take on the cultural embeddedness of sexuality and its relation to pornography and eroticism, also the differentiation of these two spheres. Can you expand a little bit of this? And well, coming back to the opposition between the possibility of expanding the limit of sex as we know it to modify, manipulate, and produce new sexual encounters, or reaffirming normative sexuality. The conclusion of your book seems to me pretty disillusioned about the first possibility. We are told that even the contribution of women composers like Annie Lockwood, Alice Shields, Pauline Oliveros, and Juliana Hodgkinson has not gone beyond the stereotypical sample sexuality evident in the first example of electrosexual works, with the exception that they are ethically irreproachable. Is the possibility of breaking the circle of traditional sexuality outside the reach of our cultural and sexual imagination? Or it depends on the medium, as you suggest? Or are the sounds of the body too mimetic or too much charged with normative sexuality's connotation for fueling our sexual fantasy, shifting from pornography to eroticism? Or is the shift's responsibility entirely in the listener's hands? It seems to me that Fish and Fowl was for you an attempt to break through. I was very curious to read about your final comment about this work. This is very interesting and catchy. But when I reached the last observation, I was baffled. I think that Fish and Fowl, after all, could be interpreted as an excellent example of overcoming further by repetition and ambiguity. Could you please comment on your conclusion about Fish and Fowl? And instead of a question, I have one last observation about the last paragraph of chapter 2 about Tiger Bomb. You write, either way, what remains evident of women is much more than their bodies. Their literal and metaphorical voices remain a persistent and uncompromising presence. And I cannot emphasize enough that without these women vocalizing, electrosexual music would not exist, nor could it exist. That's quotation end. On the other hand, if you credit the persistent and uncompromising presence of women voices, the research could expand into the field of the so-called vocal performer-composer, or in Christina Warren's term, composer-technologist-vocalist, a domain in which vocal experimentation with electronics is free from the negotiations about whom controls the voice and the sexual imaginary attached to it. So, in conclusion, I am wondering why the whole trajectory of electrosexual music you explored missed this point, the persistent and uncompromising presence of the voice. I would add the power of women's voice, reducing it all too often to the sounds of the body, even from the women composer side. And the practice of everyday life, Michel de Certeau used the expression voices of the bodies to define the repressed fragments of orality, revenants of the suppressed body, which reappear in modern theater, poetry, and vocal music. Electroacoustic music was ready to capture and reinscribe them into the traditional gender and power hierarchy. In this perspective, Luciano Berio's Visage is a good early example of the contradiction inside this genre, discovering the voices of the body through his singer partner, Kathy Barbarian, and at the same time, appropriating them in his compositional practice. So thank you for answering me at least some of my questions and my prompts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michela. Thank you very much for these very opening, broadening questions. And like we will now go on with Johann Merrich, and then we will have some time for Danielle to answer some of the questions that are posed to her. So welcome, Johann. Thank you very much for participating.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here to discuss Daniele's book, because it's shocked me somehow, but I will explain this better. First of all, I'd like to say that I'm not a musicologist. Just to be clear, that I am part of another side of the book target audience, I guess, and for this, I think that my point of view could be also nourishing, because issues that are discussed in your books, I think they must break into the life also of musicians and sound organizer, and to be discussed also like in common grounds, and to be also discussed far from the academic circles. So I think that what you did, it's absolutely important, and I really want to use many forces to spread the word about your book, because you did an amazing job, and I really enjoyed the reading. And since the first chapters and since the introduction, I was happy to meet the names of non-white composers like Francis Bebé or Alim Eldab, which are names that are not so common in the narration of electroacoustic and electronic music. And I think that every time it's a great pleasure when I see that the geography of the history of electronic music is popping out into new shapes, including finally all the rest of the world, and not just like the common trajectory that is always narrated. So thank you really for the introduction. I really enjoyed the reading. Just to say like a general comment about your book, I think that what I perceived is that it's not a common book, and I want to apologize if I'm a little bit moved and expressing like feelings about saying this, but I felt that your book was more like a kind of intellectual tool, like a way to change the way that people have to look to the history of music. I had the feeling that your book is like a kind of, I call it metaphorical pair of eyeglasses that you wear to change the way you have to look at music. And it shows, of course, in a powerful way, how many taboos we still need to break. And so by reading the first two chapters, I have to admit that I was a little bit shaken, because I find myself to confess that I never had the opportunity to see music in the way you showed us. For example, I never had the impression by listening to Henriette Schaffer's Erotica, I never had the impression of being in front of an action of sexual coercion. I never thought that using samples of voices without asking the permissions, it was really like a bad action and a way of using violence to women or to people in general. So the first two chapters were like diving into like a super cold swimming pool and saying, okay, let's stop for a moment. I never listen to music in the proper way. even if I am into the field of gender studies, even if I try to study a lot about the history of women and other so-called minorities, nevertheless, I wasn't able to listen properly to music. So I really thank you for giving me inspiration. And I was curious to know the roots of your research. So which authors or situation fed your critical spirits and prompt you to change the way you had to analyze music? Because I think, and I guess you started from somewhere. So what was the spark that led you to change your point of view and to start to have this kind of very sharp investigations and critical analysis of music? So this is one question. So I don't know if you want I can stop, or I can also ask you more. I have like 1,000 of questions to ask you, but I will be try to to be more compact.
That's up to you. As you wish, you can continue. I think I'm going to weave together my response for both of you in some way.
Okay. So the second thing is something and another. I really loved your book, so it's difficult for me to be to pack things, but I really appreciate also the second part of the research that is more focused on contemporary music, and start, for example, in dismounting the famous "Love to Love You Baby" song by Giorgio Moroder and Donna Summer, because this is the thing, no? That everyone says that it's a song by Giorgio Moroder. Even Giorgio Moroder tells this. But actually, it's something that is composed by Donna Summer. And the analysis that you did and how you dismounted and how you put back Donna Summer into her role of a woman Black composer as being really, you know, something to say thanks. Thanks for putting bad things together. And it's true. It's difficult to find the names of Black women through the pages of electronic music history books. And it's something that I'm dealing with, and I'm really trying to recollect and to understand who were these women, because I think that it's not possible that there were no Black women dealing with electronic technology. Because if you think about the name of Ollie Wilson, for example, or if you think about also NASA space project during the 50s and all these Black women employed in the computer department, I think that it's pretty strange that no Black women were playing early electronic music. So it's strange. Their names should be somewhere, and it's the only name that I was aware. It was the one of Lavinia Williams, who was married with Leon Termen in the 30s in New York City, and she is one of the most important master of the Terzo platform, but no one, or at least like few people are aware about this or speaks about this. And when you find news about Lavinia Williams, you find her named as an exotic dancer, or like a hot cha dancer, so like a sexy, beautiful naked woman dancing on a Termin platform, and she's never told like what she was. I mean, a pioneer of performing arts and electronic sound art. So I was wondering if you can recall more names of Black women active in the early days of electronic music history. And another question that is connected to this question is about methodology, because when I try to research around this topic, it's very difficult because you don't know what kind of keywords must be used in databases, like you were saying before, and also in a previous article you published. What suggestion would you give to researchers? How can we avoid socio-technical biases? Something that you maybe already discusses, but I don't know. I don't think there is like a solution. But maybe you can give us some tips, some suggestions on how to try to avoid these biases. And another last question is about Pauline Oliveros and her participation in Annie Sprinkle's movie. I really appreciate the fact that you restricted the selection of the works treated in your books to those deemed erotic or sexual by their creators, because sometimes in popular studies or in blog that speaks about women in electronics or the so-called minorities, people tends to use the issues of feminism even when there is no need to use this word or to see this meaning. But things like the participation of Oliveros in this soundtrack of a porno movie that has got educational focus, educational goals, etc., should be something that should be written and used as an argument to speak about these things. But unfortunately, I never found this any information about Oliveros' participation in Annie Sprinkle's Lads and Goddess. So I was wondering where did you find this information first? How did you came in contact with this composition? And if you wanted to share with us the adventure on this in this analysis.
Thank you very much, Johann, for this passionate response, and also for pointing out arguments about methodology and how to conduct this research, which is always very important. Now, as Daniele answers, I invite everyone who wants to ask a question to write it into the chat or to raise your hands. Quindi, mentre Daniele risponde a queste domande che le sono arrivate, se qualcuno di voi vuole fare delle domande, vi invito a farle. Scrivetele nella chat o usate la funzione di alzata di mano di Zoom. Potete anche farle in italiano e cercheremo di fare il nostro meglio per tradurle. So, Daniele, I'm so curious about your answers, and thank you.
Wow, wonderful questions. I think these questions could fuel us to go for at least a whole other article, a whole other book. And I hesitate to summarize and to cut things shorter, but at the same time, I think there is kind of a narrative that I can construct here that will help answer some of these questions. And maybe if I don't answer something, you can ask again something more specific that you have. But I love this well, both of the metaphors that you use, Johann, the metaphorical pair of eyeglasses. First of all, this is exactly what I was going for when I said, okay, I'm only looking at pieces that have sexuality in them, because I came to electronic music or electroacoustic music really in graduate school, and I had an interest, and I said, okay, well, I want to learn computation, I want to learn coding, I want to learn all these things that supposedly you need to know as an electroacoustic person. But on the other side of that, I mean, that area is already marginalized. Let's acknowledge that, from Western classical music, or even academic music studies, popular music on the one side versus classical music. And so it felt very much like a whole new world of me uncovering, unpacking these things. And so a lot of my motivation was to say, well, what music even exists here? Because I think we have maybe 2-3 textbooks on the subject, and they very much draw the lineage from either French musique concrète or the German elektronische Musik, which is what some people would say the more synthesized. But in reality, when we look at those histories, that's even itself is not so cut and dry. And at the same time, yes, we have people working all over the world in electronic music. And so I kind of said, well, I don't want to limit what electronic music is. I'm going to accept any kind, even if that means an electrified guitar. And if we're talking about musique concrète, then we're talking about sound recording, and we're talking about the process of sound recording, which started in the 20s and 30s, really to be very popular and commercial. And so you can't exclude that either. So then just saying I'm looking at sex, that was one thing. But then to jump over to Michela's question, let me just move over here to my other side here. So Michela was asking kind of to guide the listener through some of the reasons that I was trying to understand where sex appears in music, and that on its own. So I thought just saying electroacoustic music would narrow the group, but then trying to figure out, well, what is sex, that made it explode again. And I kind of found 2 different threads. There's one is the thread that is, this is music that makes me aroused, and this is music that is deliberately supposed to conjure sex. And so Tia Denora has a famous article from 30 years ago now, on the subject, where she actually does some ethnographic interviews with folks who talk about like Ravel's Bolero making them excited and things like that. And I thought, oh, that's a completely different thing. Let me take that out. And I wanted to choose music that was sexy because the composer says so, because of the title, because of the sounds that we might hear that come across in that way. But the more that I investigated this, the more I realized there actually is no distinction between these 2 categories. Because if you look at a composer like Luc Ferrari, who has Le Danse Organique is one of his pieces where he takes 2 lesbian performers and stages this encounter between them. And when the performers were interviewed, they were very generous with him, saying that the reason that they wanted, that they think he wanted to stage it in that way was actually as a form of participation. So he couldn't actually be a lesbian in the scene, but he could participate by listening intimately in that way. And these were sounds that he himself says are intimate, that aroused him. Now, personally, when I think about what Johann was saying before about this issue of found sounds and using voices from women in other pieces, for example, in Presque Rien, where he takes women's voices and he doesn't ask their permission, I found that reprehensible. If it was my voice and I heard it suddenly and it's supposed to be sexy, that's not alluring to me. So it's at this point, there's a breakdown between the 2 schemes. You can't just focus on music that is sexual because the composer says it is, because it's also arousing for him and for his followers. There's now, for several years now, the Ferrari Foundation has run this competition of writing pieces that are called Presque Rien in that style. And so all the composers to do that. Microphone cut out. Sorry. Okay. I don't know. Should I keep going? There's questions coming up.
Yeah, there are questions. So there is, the first one was posted in the chat, and then we can give the word to Edoardo Risaliti. So I will first read the question in the chat by Anni Ishi. I'm just starting the book, so I apologize if this is addressed, but I'm curious if the sex sounds that fall outside of heteronormative status quo exist outside of archive and academe by the self-elected refusal to join that status quo. I'm thinking of even the fact that many composers won't call themselves composers, producers, etc. Great question. Thank you very much for contributing.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And the short answer is yes. So I have a few case studies. I mean, Barry Truax's music is considered homoerotic, but I read it through a more open-ended analysis of the particular piece that I look at. So more of a trans perspective where the voices aren't specifically gendered in the binary. There's Luke Ferrari's pieces for lesbians, but there is also music written by lesbians. And this is another issue that comes up is so when I was trying to find composers of color to include in my stipulation, they must be electroacoustic and they must write about sexuality, I didn't find any. I think if you go to Electro CD, which is the electroacoustic sort of database of all the music, when you search through the list of artists, there's thousands of them, and I did a sort of a big metadata analysis, and so there are many composers of color, and so Toru Takumitsu, for example, is a composer who comes up a lot, who I didn't include in the book for various reasons, but outside of him, the composers that do come up are not composers who have written sexual pieces. And this is something that I kind of wrestled with. Why not? And is that because they're aware of this this kind of association of sexuality with popular music and the tradition in electroacoustic music of distancing electroacoustic composers from popular music? And this goes into the history of the origins of electronic music and sound recording. So in the book, I talk about the concept of the veil. So we all know the history of acousmatic music is being to veil what we see so that we're only listening with our ears, also called the cinema for the ears. And a lot of times this is tied to Pythagoras because he used to lecture from behind a curtain, and only the most important students could come to be in the other side of the curtain to see him. Now, in the late 19th century, there were a lot of touring African-American musical troupes. Probably the most famous was the Fisk Jubilee Singers. And their first performance, now they performed everywhere. They performed in Indonesia, they performed in Europe, they performed all over the United States, they were all over the place. But their first premiere in the United States, they were asked to sing from behind a curtain. And this was because the white audience couldn't reconcile this pleasure of hearing the music that they enjoyed so much with the physical presence of a Black performer. And this is what I think also contributed to the popularity of the sound recording business, because the earliest records that were popularized and made the most sales were by Black blues women singers. Those are the first electroacoustic composers. They are singing about sexuality, about the Black situation in the US, but also across the Atlantic. And as I said, these singers, these performers, they are touring around the world. And also that by facet of having the records, you divorce the site. So it makes it easier for the music to be consumed, because you aren't struggling with this feeling that's happening in the culture socially at the time. I don't think it's completely gone away, but I think it's a little distant for us now to remember or to feel what that was like when you're in a white supremacist society and you're the only ones that are allowed to buy tickets to a concert and attend a concert while you're watching on stage a performer who's not allowed to live in the same social space as you. But you can very easily listen to them on your sound recording and do manipulations with the record and do all kinds of things like that. Now, in Black spaces, this was celebrated because they they wanted this music to get out there. But I think that, again, it's the same question about separating people who are aroused by music versus people who write music that is sexual, is that the same music has two different interpretations depending on the social situation of the person who is interpreting that music. And so this is also why queer theory has also a double-sided edge to it. You can talk about music that is explicitly queer, but that also includes people like Luke Ferrari, who himself is not queer, and he's staging these queer performances. Or you can talk about a queer lens. Well, I, as a listener, hear music in this way, like Fred Moss's analysis of the Pet Shop Boys is a very good example of hearing queerness in music that isn't necessarily supposed to sound like that.
Well, thank you very much for this amazing answer to a really, really great question. So I think there is another question in the chat, but I will give the word to Eduardo Risoliti first, who raised his hand. Thank you for participating. So please ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm interested in porn studies, so I will try to put those glasses on and try to ask you about sounds and music in porn, because I will have to make a paper about sounds and music in porn for a semiotics of cultural of music cultures, and I would like to know what do you think about the presence and the absence of music in porn and in between the porn the porn play, and also which are the meanings of the sounds in porn.
Great. Yes, thank you for that question. That was actually something I meant to say before, but I didn't get to it. So thank you for reminding me about that. I think there's a lots of different interesting ways that you can go. There's an amazing chapter by Constance Penley that's about stereotypes of in pornography, and she talks about for example, the stereotype of white trash in America. You can think of country music, of the like stupid person who marries their cousin, that kind of aesthetic, and talking about how humor comes out in pornography. And so what she says is that these stereotypes are essentialized so much deliberately because they cause pleasure, they cause joy, which is on the same wavelength, and that the reduction, the essentialism, helps with the fantasy. And it doesn't, in this case, the fantasy extends beyond the actual sex act. It's not just what is going on, but also what plays into that. And so music can set the stage for that in different ways. I mean, depending on whether the music sounds like it's supposed to be there or doesn't sound like it's supposed to be there. A different interpretation to this was about 10 years before that from Linda Williams. She has this book about pornography, but her interpretation, she actually comes as a musicologist. She doesn't say she's a musicologist, but she comes from studying musical theater. That's her background. And she identifies that the actual sex acts of pornography are like the musical acts in a musical. And that the reason that they come there are to further the narrative, in the sense that you have to have a certain number of acts in a production. And so you have the kissing, and you have the conolingus, and you have the penetration, and she names all of these things, and kind of says this is parallel to the role that music might play in a musical. I think it's interesting to to consider the tension of those two interpretations, that the actual presence of music and the sex acts at the same time, and that wondering whether they could be interchangeable. And I think very much that depends on the film and what the audience expectations are there. I mean, now, like, asking about pornography today is like asking about, like, what contributions can YouTube make? It's so vast, it's so diverse, the landscape is so pluralistic, and can reach so many extremes that it's no longer about sexuality. It's not specifically about one type of media, which is, let's say, video. But there's just so many moving parts there that you have to choose a specific genre within, I think, to be able to pull it apart and really do it justice. But in general, that's my impression, that there are these kind of competing theories there that I think are pretty useful.
Thank you very much. Very interesting question and very interesting answer. So we go to the next question. So thank you very much to this audience. I'm very grateful for such a level of engagement. So the next one comes from John van de Ved. The question is, would you say that guilt and shame stops many electroacoustic composers from embracing the ambiguity of our music? It's sexualized and or sexual? Thank you very much for this question.
Yeah, I think this is a good question. And I will reverse the question. And this is what I struggled with exactly is, but why is it that composers like Schaeffer, like Ferrari, like Normando, like Moroder, why do they not feel shame and guilt? What is it that allows them to express themselves in this way, and that people receive it and accept it? And exactly, so it has to do with there is a hierarchy there of what is permissible and who can perform that role. And I think that ideally, so this is what happened with the book, is I was reading McClary and you know, ages ago, and Cusick, and when I first encountered these readings from the 1990s about sexuality, I thought they were completely essentialist. I thought that they were so gendered, like to be just dividing men have to move to a climax, and that's why it's masculine in the music, and women have this other approach, and then you have these divisions. And if you go into feminism or queer theory, you have these divisions. You have the separatists, who were the separatist feminisms, who decided that women are women and they're different and that's the way it is, versus if you change the axes, the queer axes, you have queer women who also have an affinity with queer men because of the way that they are discriminated against in society. But I thought that was complete bullshit. And I actually started the book trying to figure out how to critique this. And so the question is not so much about the people themselves, but rather the medium is what I find. So now I do agree with McClary's analyses, but I don't think it's because all men respond this way or all women are XYZ, but because this is the way that music is repeatedly presented to us. These analyses are, you know, McClary's analysis at the time made people angry, in part, I think, because what I drew out in my book is that the sounds of sex in pornography and historically often are attributed to women. Women are vocalizing, women are the audible ones. And she made Beethoven the audible one. And that was jarring for people to say a man is expressing his sexual voice. Now, the second part of that is the way he's expressing it, and that's a different thing. And she's critiquing him for being aggressive and having these this approach that is anti-women. And that's something that's also debatable, but these are kind of two separate questions about being audible as a man expressing sexuality, which is what the electroacoustic composers I identify are doing, and to commend that because they're not doing that in other spaces, versus what's going on in popular music studies. Well, what was happening for a very long time, which was to say, oh, Donna Summer is sexy because she's moaning on the video, and therefore that is sexy music. And then if you try to, let's say, so we're talking about research, how did I find this music? Well, I had to learn a lot of different media. I had to just listen and listen and listen and watch and try to find things. And if I found something, I have to take a note. And like, you have to be very good at note taking because you have to be able to find those notes later that you wrote down and said it was somehow connected. Also, you know, people coming up to me in spaces like this. Have you heard of this piece? Have you seen this? I think with the Paulina Oliveras example, I actually found Annie Sprinkle first, because she was talking about the breath. She has on her website, you can find that she has this whole analysis of the breath and how that plays into our expression of orgasms. And so she really talks about in a somewhat in a sonic experiential way about breathing in a certain rhythm, the depth of the breath, where it's located in the body, how to control the breath. And so it sounds to me like vocal pedagogy, in the sense that, you know, you're grounding yourself with your breath. And so her performance and the way she was practicing, I think, was very much in tune with the performance artist sides of things. And it's not just reduced to the act in the moment, but there's a larger question about how does art capture our expression, our physical bodies, and these more, let's say, canonical questions in art. Is art mimicking life, or is life mimicking art? And so very much the question of the sonic, this question of whether we feel ashamed or not has to do with how much repetition we've had, of how much our lives are mimicking what we are consuming in the media. And so that made me feel, okay, well, now we actually did confirm what was going on. I have a different article where I was asked specifically to talk about McClary's history and her actual context, where I pull apart not just feminine endings, but I bring in her discussion of difficult composers and the avant-garde, and kind of a much broader lens of her impact. And so that's in the ZGMTH, so the German music theory journal, and it's called Spectres of Sex, and you can read about that, and where I talk about how queer theory within music spaces has actually been very reductive, because it's very concerned with how composers who are already canonical might be seen otherwise. So queering the composer, or queering the theorist that is already celebrated. And so we're not actually marginalized. I mean, we're not actually, we're still marginalizing folks who have been marginalized the whole time. We're not actually opening up the discussion, but always talking about the same composers from a different lens.
Thank you very much for this answer and this question. And we have another one in the chat, like another question in the chat by Laura Zattra. So I will read it. Teresa Rampazzi, Italian pioneer of electronic music, stated in 1983, there are neither male nor female notes, sounds in music. She also said, on the other hand, that, quote, there is music written by men that could easily pass for women's music and vice versa. We immediately think, when we say feminine, of sweet, refined, delicate expressions. No, a woman can be robust, perhaps more than a man can be, end quote. Teresa lived in a city, Padova, north of Italy, where there was a strong feminist community, and she herself was very active in political discussions. She was a communist in a Catholic city, just to explain who she was. My questions are, how could we find sexuality expressed in music in composers like Teresa Rampazzi, who do not intend their music as a sexualized art? What could be the best tools, objective tools in musicology to analyze these hidden aspects? And in a larger sense, do you believe in biographism and in the relationship between the personal history and the artistic result? Are we musicologists supposed to search these links? Many questions here. Thank you very much, Laura, for this. And please, Danielle, take it.
Yes, very rich. Thank you. This is a great quote here, and it expresses exactly this difficulty that we encounter, that on the one hand, I as a person don't see myself as a person who is gendered in a particular way or sexualized in a particular way, and when I create something, I'm not coming from that necessarily. But at the same time, as soon as the media is out there, that is how it's interpreted. I mean, going back to communication theorists, the early days, you know, Stuart Hall saying that there is no media without interpretation. It doesn't exist. It cannot be out there without being received. And I think it is a very difficult question to say, well, okay, how do we examine sex in spaces where sexuality isn't meant to be? And we can be talking here about Teresa Rampazzi, or we can be talking about Schubert. And I think it's more difficult when we're talking about music that's closer to where we are now, because there have been so many influences in the 20th century. This exploded where you can take sounds from another place completely, put them together in a piece with sounds that don't exist anywhere in the world at all, and people can still make sense of this. But you can't control how people will make sense of it. They just will make sense of it. It's much simpler to say, oh, let's go back to, you know, in this case, let's say Bach and Schubert are the same person, or you know, the same timeline, and their music can be explored through the same tools, which is how I learned it. Oh, we're looking at chords, okay, and here is, if I'm talking about sonata form in a symphony, then this is the exposition, and here is the development, and here's the recapitulation, and that's how I'm talking about. But we never zoomed out before until now to say, but why is that a chord? What is a chord? Why do I hear 3 pitches? All of that is trained. That's all is social. It's all enculturated in the context of the time. And so we are very accustomed to thinking about electroacoustic music in that way. So maybe we're very skilled at pulling sounds apart and saying, oh, there is this layer and this layer and this layer, and here's the timbre, and here is how it's shifting over time. And we can use a theory like Dennis Smalley's theories, where he talks about gesture as being the impetus behind sounds, because we don't have the vocabulary really to talk about sounds that exist that we've never heard before. And so we talk about, oh, this being a strong sound or a continuous repetition, or, you know, these kinds of parameters. And I think we should very much be looking at classical music through that lens too, and taking those terminologies and pulling apart the music in ways that is not already determined by the tonality, by the instrumentation of the orchestra that's already a priori, like we already assume that it's there and we understand it that way. On the other hand, we can't ignore that Schubert was working in that syntax. He was deliberately employing that language. And so it's very easy to collapse that right away and say, oh, let's start from this. But that's the middle of the story, starting from chords and scales. And so in today's electroacoustic music, I think if you want to talk about sexuality where it's not intended to be, the ethical thing to do is to ask, what are your motivations? Who's your audience? Why do you want to examine something like that, and what does it contribute, and to whom? Because very often when we are finding sexuality in spaces where it doesn't exist, we're putting something of ourselves into the space, and we don't want to jump to the middle of the story. We need to accept that it's our story that we've put in there, that we are analyzing it through our own lens. And then you have to ask yourself very difficult questions. And sometimes, writing this book, I had to ask myself, well, am I a sex maniac? Like, why am I looking at this? Like, what is the point of this? And is anybody going to care in the end? Because at the end of the day, most of the time we're just talking about, if people want to have sex, they're having sex. They're not going to go read a book about having sex. That's like the opposite of what they want to do. That's like telling the punchline of the joke. So yeah, I think personally, if you are reflective enough throughout the process and you go through the soul searching, then you can find sexuality in places where the composers didn't intend it. But the question is, what is the larger goal there? And with Schubert, it was more to normalize that there existed a composer who wrote in this medium who also did these other things, and not necessarily to say this music is gay.
Thank you very much, Daniele. Can I ask just like a very last super burning question that I have, but it will take just 1 minute. When I was reading the book, one thing that surprised me is how much sexuality has changed, even in that short span of time that your book covers, which is not long in the end. It's like half of a century. And so whenever we analyze cultural aspects of music, we also have to immerse in that kind of culture, which is both geographical and temporal. And sometimes I find very interesting to also read my reaction in terms of temporal detachment from the ideas and the experience that that were expressed. So I was wondering if that was a difficult aspect in the analysis of the examples, or if you could read culturally through all examples equally. And yeah.
Yes, and this ties us back to another question that Michela asked, kind of asking me about my interpretation of Fish and Fowl, and whether maybe I was being too hard on the composers and saying that they played back into these electrosexual tropes without contributing anything. I didn't mean that they didn't contribute anything, but that was the first piece I started with, and then I had to keep rewriting that chapter, and it's also the last chapter I wrote. So I wrote it from the beginning to the end several times. And part of the reason behind that was, first of all, the composers themselves didn't agree on what was going on in the music. So there's a man and a woman composing this piece. And even though for 3 days they were locked in a studio together doing this based on pieces that they had in their history, when I started interviewing them in 2012, they both gave this impression of like, we wanted to explode what sexuality was. But it sounded very much like they were just doing this musique concrète thing of chopping up the pieces that existed and taping them back together. And it's only in I think it was 2020, I interviewed them after we went through many iterations, but I met them again after finishing the chapter, because they both said, what, this isn't what we met at all. So then I met with them, and it seems that they actually changed their opinions about the piece themselves. So first of all, one of the composers decided that their music was actually playing into some of these essentialist tropes early on. And so that was part of the difficulty, is that when you recompose the piece in a new context, that stuff stays there. And so that made them recognize that. Another thing is that one of the composers was then more open than they had been previously. Before, they didn't actually convey that this was that part of what was going on in the piece was a response to a negative experience that they had had. And it was an expression of their own, participation in this sexual power hierarchy that exists in the world. And so using these instruments as a way of expressing backlash, or kind of coming to terms with what had happened to them. And at this point, it's kind of like, I'm not sure if the composers were aware of this stuff the whole time, or if maybe something I shook something in their brain that changed the way they thought about it. And so that's only this like one piece in this little temporal time of 10 years, and then thinking over all this times how things have changed. And I don't think my interpretation could have existed when I started this project. I don't think I could have said what I said in the book now 10 years ago. I think that people would have rejected it, and that's it. That would have been the end of the story. And I didn't feel comfortable either. So I hope the book persists. I hope it doesn't disappear in the next year, but who knows?
I am sure it will not. So I know I have used everyone's time with that last burning question, but I really couldn't resist. And now we arrived at the final, actually, we're even like 2 minutes late. So I will just go straight into thanking everyone. So first of all, thanks, Danielle, for this very generous presentation, very generous answering session, and honestly, very generous scholarship in this book, which will last, I'm pretty sure it will last. And then thanks to Michela and Johann for participating very generously to this webinar. I was so happy that you accepted, and I feel like this was the right group of people to talk with about this topic. And then thank you very much to the audience, which has been amazing. Thank you for your participation and your amazing questions and comments in the chat. It was really lovely to meet with you, even just virtually. And then thank you to Laura Zatra and Giacomo Albert for the technical support, the organizational support, for creating RiSME, this amazing study group, and to the IME and the Italian Musicological Society for the institutional support for this. So a big round of applause to all our speakers and participants. Thank you very much to everyone.